right. Good day, everyone. We are here again with Kit Klarenberg. Most of you will probably know him. He was here last time in a panel with Ali Alizadeh. And Kit Klarenberg, of course, is an amazing investigative journalist working not only for his own Substack, Kit Klarenberg, but also for other outlets such as The Grey Zone, doing a lot of work on whatever geopolitics, but also, for example, media in the UK. A lot of stuff that Kit is focusing on. And it's a very funny story. How did we actually get into contact with Kit? I noticed that some of my articles were being liked and shared by Kit Klarenberg, and I realized, okay, if an amazing journalist as Kit Klarenberg likes my stuff, that means that people who are now watching need to go to our Substack and subscribe and read my articles, because if Kit likes it, there must be something good about it. So I wanted to make use of that. I wanted to make use of that phenomenon. Kit, welcome. And I think Peter wants to start off with a question for you.
Yeah, welcome.
Sure.
So I'm going to try to pick your brain about the state of the media now. Probably like you and like a lot of people watching. Many years ago, I read Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. And it made a lot of sense to me. This was during the Iraq War, the war on Afghanistan, the war of terror. And it explained very well the kind of structural pressures operating on the U.S. media system that effectively turned it into a de facto propaganda system, although they were agnostic about, to the extent to which there was any sort of top-down direction. Really, with the structural pressures that they identified, there was really no need for top-down direction. But what I found really interesting in reading critiques or book reviews of the book was that it seemed like every single critic had to propose that, in fact, the book was a conspiracy theory, that it was proposing that there's somebody at the top pulling the strings of all these media organizations, whatever. And that was very striking to me. And that's what led me to write my book, which I jokingly called Manufacturing Consent 2, because I just add psychology to the picture that they already lay out to explain how you can have a system operating as just a de facto propaganda system without anyone consciously necessarily thinking, I know the truth, but I am going to spread lies because I want the dumb sheep to believe these lies, but I know the truth. So anyway, I was super interested in that. And one aspect of the broader political economy of media literature, I don't remember if it was really that much of manufacturing consent or not, but there are lots of other people who have explored the political economy of media. And one factor that now I'm starting to think that I underestimated was what was called the sociology of the profession. Basically, like the way that, 80, 90, 100 years ago, there were lots of journalists who came from working class backgrounds, all sorts of different professions. They would end up working for various outlets, maybe a labor union's newspaper, whatever the case. But they actually had different class backgrounds. Whereas over the past, half century or so, we've seen this transition to journalists has become a credentialed profession like so many others. And basically so many journalists now have been fed through the diploma mills of Columbia, J School, and a bunch of others. And so now I'm basically, okay, I have so many questions, but let me just start off with, what do you think about this whole sociology of the profession idea? You're kind of in an outlet that is avoided like the plague by our best and brightest at the New York Times, et cetera. But do you have connections? Do you have a feel for how does this profession operate among journalists working for mass media outlets? Do they still tend to socialize together? Do they still tend to have similar backgrounds? Could you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is quite a broad question, but I mean, I can also speak from personal experience as well. And I mean, I think that the British media is in international terms, particularly bad in the specific regards that you talk about. So, I mean, it's an extreme example, but it's applicable to other countries. When I graduated from university, which was almost 20 years ago now, I'm getting old, but it was basically impossible to get a job in journalism or get onto some graduate scheme unless you had a degree from a top 10 university, or you or had a journalism qualification from one of the top institutions in the field. And now this creates a system where people who do get into journalism are usually very, very, very concerned about holding on to their jobs because it's extremely competitive. But it also means that a large number of people within journalism, they not only went to school with each other, they went to school with a lot of the people they end up writing about. So it creates this kind of chummy, kind of crony culture within journalism. Now, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, or you and your viewers and listeners are forgiven if you're not. But a few weeks back, there was a scandal in the UK, which it blew up pretty quickly, but then got just forgotten about, in no small part due to the war in Iran, where it was revealed that Labour Together, which was this very shady think tank that was heavily tied up with Peter Mandelson, this kind of very sinister, unflushable turd of British politics, who was a close associate of Tony Blair, and also it was closely connected with Keir Starmer and his kind of cabal within the party. That they'd been paying PR firms to create dossiers of dirt on journalists who were delving into Labour Together's finances, which is, it was they were very corrupt, and it gave Keir Starmer the best part of £1 million for his leadership campaign without declaring it, or declaring where it was coming from, which it was, wealthy Zionist donors who stopped funding the party under Corbyn. Now, there are several components to this, but one of the journalists who got targeted was the Times reporter Gabriel Pogrund, and in a podcast with the Times, discussing the scandal, he talks about how, we reported on Labour Together's finances in November 2023, and we were slightly concerned about pursuing the story because at the time, this was a period in which nobody wanted criticism of Keir Starmer. I mean, who is he to make that judgment? And, is that really the case? Because, there was an enormous number of people, including Labour members who were removed from the party on spurious grounds because they were left-wing, absolutely did want scrutiny of Keir Starmer, who is, an individual with a very shady past, which involved, while he was running Britain's Crown Prosecution Service, concealing the crimes of Jimmy Savile, insulating MI5 and MI6 from prosecution over torture, despite the fact that London's Metropolitan Police collected thousands of pages of absolutely damning evidence, implicating the individual MI6 officers who were involved in signing off on rendition operations, or sat in on the torture of detainees by foreign intelligence services. So, I mean, there was a general vibe.
Sorry for interrupting, Kit. Cleansing the party of any left-wing forces, and some of some black politicians as well. What's the black lady's name that was completely?
Oh, Diane Abbott. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Diane Abbott. Yeah, and Jeremy Corbyn. So there was a lot of reasons to delve in critically into Keir Starmer's past. But the general narrative amongst mainstream journalists was, that's not what people want, so we shouldn't really go near it. And Pogrund continued by saying that the general story, quote unquote, was that the Tories were finished, the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was on his last legs, and Keir Starmer was the Prime Minister in waiting. And so we were concerned about going near this story, which ended up on the Times front page. It didn't really have very much of an impact, it must be said, despite all of their concerns that it might harm Starmer, although it did send Labour Together into a frenzy and prompted them to hire this PR firm to spy on and smear journalists to kill off the story. Now, there are a number of other strands to this scandal which we can get into if you wish, but I just think it was very interesting to have a journalist basically lay out the terms of an informal conspiracy in which mainstream journalists are engaged. That the general story was that that Starmer is the PM in waiting, so we can't really criticise him. I mean, who sets the terms of that general story, and does that in any way reflect, public opinion, let alone any commitment to truth? Of course it doesn't. But I think it's a very interesting reflection and demonstration of how, mainstream journalists internalize all manner of concerns. So when I broke into journalism, I started off working for financial and legal magazines, which obviously had tiny readerships, etc. And I kind of realised very early on that I wasn't going to be there for very long, because by token of asking awkward questions, or not not being so on board with just regurgitating press releases or writing down without caveats what an important, powerful person has said, then that made me a troublemaker by definition. And I remember all sorts of arguments I had with editors where a story would break and I wasn't allowed to go near. I wanted to report on it and I wasn't allowed to go near it because, the company, say like a bank was involved in fraud. That's a very newsworthy story. But hey, that bank advertises with us, so we can't go near it. And you end up having to internalize all of this stuff and see it as very normal. I don't think that mainstream journalists have the level of kind of self-reflection to go public about this or criticize it. If they do, then they're out of a job. So, I mean, there is this kind of self-perpetuating cycle here. Now, I mean, in British terms, there are numerous formal structures which cement and further kind of deepen this crony model of journalism. So this is something that I've written about, and I would urge people to check out my story on this with William Evans, who's this kind of young independent Australian journalist. There is a body in the UK called the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee. It is run out of the Ministry of Defence. It's staffed by veteran military and intelligence apparatchiks, and it regularly meets with editors of mainstream newspapers and representatives of press associations and journalists themselves. And they on the one hand arrange exclusive trips around the headquarters of GCHQ and other kind of spying agencies, etc. But they also give briefings to the media on what they can and can't report on matters related to national security, which is extremely broad and means whatever the government wants it to mean, of course.
So,
and
is that the agency that issues the D notices? Is that the agency?
Yeah. So on top of having these summits, which they publish official minutes, which are sometimes revealing, sometimes not very revealing. But they also issue what are known as D notices. Now these D notices have no legal power. The government can't tell journalists to not report on things with they don't have by law, but they don't have legal force. But there is a sense among journalists that we can't piss these people off, and particularly when you have this kind of very, very chummy relationship with powerful people, when they get in touch with you and say, oh well, could you please not mention this fact, or don't mention this person's name, or just leave this story alone. Most of the time they're inclined to do it. And in my recent story on the DSMA, William Evans and I reported on freedom of information, documents we required via freedom of information, where the DSMA committee in internal memos boasts about how it has a 90% success rate in deterring journalists from going near stories or reporting on specific facts. And this is a voluntary system. Okay, so there are examples of it being broken, and they usually aren't serious professional or legal consequences for doing so, but that is a threat. And journalists know that, well, I'm going to be cut out of briefings, government ministers won't speak to me, sources won't give me scoops, so best to leave it alone, even if the information that they want to report on is in the public domain. And there are all sorts of very revealing passages in these documents which refer to how journalists submit their stories voluntarily to the DSMA committee, and the DSMA committee then edits them for the journalists before publication. And there are all manner of examples of stories being left well alone as a result of DSMA intervention. In November 2023, the committee wrote to journalists and editors in Britain and said, we are concerned about stories related to British Special Forces counter-terror operations in Gaza seeping out into the public domain. Could you please consult with us before reporting on this story? Which is to say that British forces were and are directly involved in the Gaza genocide. But the entire British media has not gone near this story. At the direct request of the British government, in effect, there are so many examples of this throughout history. In the Snowden revelations that the Guardian reported on in 2013, the entire British media left it alone. Aside from op-eds in the Daily Telegraph and other right-wing newspapers suggesting Snowden was a Russian asset, and that he is actually a danger to national security and he shouldn't have done this, and blah blah. So it's a very, very, very effective system, and I would imagine that informal mechanisms like this exist all over the world, and just more generally. As I say, I think that journalists know that there are things that they can't say. That, well, if I report on this, it will be treading on this person or this organization's toes, and it's better for my career that I keep stum about it. And of course, journalists themselves, because a huge part of their kind of marketing is that they speak truth to power, which is a very self-serving view, and it assumes that power is interested in the truth, which it isn't. But that's how they sell themselves to the public, and there are all sorts of movies featuring the crusading journalists who take down the government, like All the President's Men about Watergate, which are a complete fiction, of course, but this is how journalists are perceived in many quarters, including journalists themselves, when they know the reality is very different to what that they've been told for most of their lives, and indeed the general public believes. But on that point, and more generally, I do see a very encouraging shift in public attitudes all over the Western world about the mainstream media, because people can see in real time the extent to which it is skewed, distorted. I think particularly around the Gaza genocide. The amount of the sheer number of mainstream reports which engage in kind of Orwellian distortion of language to try and distance and diminish Israel's actions. It's like, 30 Palestinians killed in gunfire in Gaza. Who did the killing? Who were they? Why? These facts are not reflected in mainstream reporting. And then by contrast, when IDF soldiers get killed, their photos are plastered all over the media, and we're told how they liked animals and that sort of thing. And people can see that it is a sham, but at the same time, I do think there is a quite terrifying, because of Western narrative dominance, which cuts across culture and the arts and films and TV. I do think that wider narratives are more difficult to dislodge. Although that said, we have seen across globally a huge and I think irreversible shift on attitudes towards Israel. I mean, it's like the most hated country in the world by a considerable margin, and with good reason. So I mean, there is some cause for optimism, and historic trust in the media, pretty much everywhere in Europe or North America is at record lows. People are moving away from mainstream publications, and a lot of major established news outlets are doing very poorly indeed. So I mean that's encouraging.
Yeah, indeed. Is that your answer? Kind of sounded like the question would be better rephrased as like, are there different sociologies of the profession in different countries? Because it sounded like the situation in England or Britain is particularly dangerous for journalism because of that the smallness overall. So a lot of these journalists who go to these schools that get the jobs in the mass media oftentimes go to school with the same people they're supposed to report on, which is, I think, a little different from the US. Like, you do have that to some extent, but it's just such a bigger country. You would probably have fewer direct, close personal connections between people going to J school and people who end up in politics or leading business. But maybe the a better question then would be, when it comes to international coverage. So when you have foreign journalists in the UK, or to the extent that UK journalists in other countries, do they still tend to stay at the same hotels? Hang around together while they're covering a story, such that just even when they're not writing or working directly, they're socializing with each other, and in that process, psychologically, it's very easy to see how opinions can converge on the same perspective for a bunch of different reasons. But you can get the kind of pressure when you're in the same perceived peer group. Is that still going on, or do you see, the last part of your answer was, the mass media, even in Europe, is failing. Not that anyone here, I think, should shed too many tears about that, but do you think then that is changing the sociology of the profession and making that aspect or influence on media coverage less important or more important? How do you see that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, I think that all elites care about really is the mainstream media, because the people who still read this garbage are often in positions of influence. So, I mean, I have a story forthcoming on the emails of a veteran, former quote unquote MI6 officer leaked online, and there are some pretty extraordinary exchanges in this correspondence, where, for instance, just out of the blue, a journalist from a mainstream publication will get in touch with him, this veteran MI6 officer, and say, "Oh well, I'm writing this story about Vladimir Putin. Could you possibly give me some, directions and deep background?" So rather than using Google to research this very well-trodden topic of how Putin is this really evil guy, you get in touch with MI6, and they give you some color and copy and other people to speak to inform your stories. But what's interesting is that there's also other correspondence in this wider tranche is this same MI6 officer sharing with his friends absolutely nonsense stories that the mainstream media has published, without any apparent consideration that it's probably also based on briefings from kind of black propaganda fed to the journalists in question by military and intelligence people. So, I mean, in my experience, people who work for governments, or people who work in finance, or people who work in other kind of elite professions, they do read the mainstream media and they do believe a lot of it. So that's what governments remain concerned about. Average people who, in their minds, have no power. They're less concerned about what they think these days, and there are a number of kind of formal and informal censorship mechanisms which can ensure that dissident voices and inconvenient truths aren't widely known. I mean, again, from my own experience, it's basically impossible to find my Twitter or website when you search for my name on Google, whereas if you search for pretty much anyone else's name on Google, these will be the first results that come up, their Substack and or their Twitter. So I mean, there's suppression afoot, and it is multi-spectrum. It covers search engines, the Wikipedia, etc. But the point is that what the mainstream media reports on is of a high degree of concern, and it does have influence with people who are at least theoretically influential. And I mean, that I think that is problematic, and it's slightly more, and it's probably a lot more difficult to overcome. And in my experience, I've spoken to mainstream journalists who have completely distorted, warped, or just ignorant takes on foreign conflicts. So I spoke to a British TV news producer, who they got in touch with me as I wrote a story on Israel's history of organ harvesting and organ trafficking. There is an enormous amount of information in the public domain about this, including reports by the European Parliament, including the records of court cases in numerous countries, including the US, where it's been discovered that some a hospital or some institution which receives funding from Israel is involved in industrial scale organ trafficking and illegal organ transplants, which is completely a very serious crime, although it doesn't really get investigated. They got in touch with me asking me if I had any proof. This TV producer got in touch with me to ask if I had any proof for my assorted claims. Now, my piece was riddled with hyperlinks to this stuff. It was all publicly available information, but they had no idea about any of it, and they also didn't find the sources themselves particularly persuasive, despite the fact it was also mainstream publications a lot of the time reporting on this stuff, because no one powerful is briefing them on this, so it's alien to them. That's how this is a kind of, call it a separate sociology, that journalists are so used to getting briefings from PR firms or government departments. The Pentagon, for instance, invests enormous amounts of money in press relations, and there is a implied threat if you annoy these people upon who you rely for news. So, I mean, all sorts of traditional methods of news gathering are pretty much dead now. And I know from speaking to journalism students that they're not taught how to file FOI requests, and this applies to journalism students I've spoken to in the UK, in the US, in Canada, and elsewhere. So this is quite a widespread phenomenon, to say the least. And
just to interrupt there, that would seem to be one of the most basic skills you'd want to teach any journalist. What are they being taught if not how to do FOIA requests? Like how to transcribe press releases? Like what? Please explain more. This is just a little surprising to me.
Yeah. That's the kind of things they're being taught, and so much of their curriculum is rewriting press releases, how to approach interviews with senior officials in government departments, etc. There is an anecdote that I'm very, very fond of, which is Matt Kennard, who's this absolutely crusading British journalist and does amazing work at enormous risk to himself.
He's been on here a few times.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, well, I would urge your viewers and listeners to check out those episodes in that case, because he is wonderful, and he actually, funnily enough, had quite a similar introduction to journalism as I. I think he attended Columbia Journalism School, I believe, and Henry Kissinger came in for a talk to speak to these journalists, and Ken had put up his hand when the time for questions came around, and he asked Kissinger, "How do you sleep at night?" which got Kennard in all manner of trouble, within the institution, and then he joined the esteemed Financial Times, and much like myself, quickly realised that he wasn't going to last very long, because his interests, the kind of stories he wanted to report on, were typically not commissioned, and if they were, then there were strict limits on what they could and couldn't report on. So people are not being taught basic news gathering techniques, and there is a wide variety of media outreach efforts all over the world, which are concerned with bombarding journalists with quote unquote news, which is manufactured, and often the people working in press departments or working for PR firms are themselves former journalists who've crossed over to the dark side in industry parlance, because the pay is better and they know how to structure things so that journalists will report on them. And I think that the typical experience of journalists in the 21st century is being sat in borderline sweatshop conditions in a cramped office somewhere, with people just sat in front of their computers all day, just being bombarded with emails, and taking directions on from their editors on what press releases to report on and what not to report on. Things are in an extremely parlous state in mainstream journalism in the 21st century. And it's interesting that during the Cold War, for instance, there was the BBC had a dedicated office within its headquarters where MI5, Britain's domestic spying agency, would look over the CVs of people who applied, and they would block people from employment on ideological grounds. So, sometimes it was really ludicrously petty. It was like, this applicant went to Prague on a student exchange trip many years ago. This means they might have been infected with communist ideology. Don't employ them. This formal blacklisting mechanism was officially wound down in the late 1980s. But I think that was maybe a reflection of the fact that they didn't need to do this anymore, rather than it being rather controversial and embarrassing for MI5 to do this, because you don't need to vet people for ideological purposes anymore. That's not really a concern, because the system itself will filter these people out one way or another.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So to get back a bit to the whole Chomsky thing that Peter said, and also the psychological aspect that I also find very important. I often think that people do not realize how important the psychological aspect is in geopolitics, and how that is shaped by the Western media. And I recently wrote an article on our Substack, and people can go and look it up. It's a very recent article where I said that all these atrocities that are happening right now pretty much keep happening if the world just doesn't decolonize from Western media. I very, very sincerely believe in that, as somebody who has worked as an academic around the world in multiple countries around the world, and I have noticed the effect of everything okay, Kit? Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. No. So I've noticed that, for example, by interacting with a lot of students, how powerful, whether you're in Japan, Malaysia, Hong Kong, how powerful the Western media is in shaping people's understanding of the world. I call that a kind of colonial mentality that is being reproduced by the Western media all over the world. And that also brings me to something that Noam Chomsky, of course, wrote about: worthy and unworthy victims, or people and unpeople, where you have a 9/11 in the United States, and for years we are grieving the victims, and we see that repeated onto our screens over and over, to the extent that the whole world thinks that's one of the worst atrocities that has ever happened. And then you have more than 1 million people dying in the Iraq war, and nobody is ever talking about it. And I think that is a serious problem, and I think that's happening now again in Iran, where you see that a girls' school gets bombed and hardly anybody is even talking about it, while it's pretty much one of the worst atrocities in modern history, let alone, of course, the genocide in Gaza. So my question is, Kit, you also live abroad. How do you see that? Do you see any change? I feel sometimes very pessimistic. I talk to Korean students, I talk to Japanese students. It's so powerful, the Western narrative. Like, do you see that there is a shift towards a more, you can almost say, indigenous kind of information system around the world? Or do you also share that pessimism that I have? Because I do not think that people around the world, maybe except China a bit, really realize how bad it is that their countries are relying on the Western narrative. I think it serves geopolitics and imperialism. How do you see that, Kit?
Yeah, well, I mean, from my own experience living in Serbia, the entire population absolutely detests the Western media and doesn't believe a word in it because they've been on the receiving end of, numerous kind of propaganda efforts, over the years and lies and libels. So, I mean, they understand very they understand very well, how the system works. But I mean, it's certainly true that the Western propaganda narratives, old and new, they do cut across borders. And I remember a few years back, I say a few years, about 10, via circuitous circumstances, started speaking to a bunch of people from New Zealand who just moved to the UK, and they were all absolutely rabid, like pro Margaret Thatcher people. Like they were completely drunk the Kool-Aid on how like Britain was on the verge of total social and economic collapse in the 1970s, and Thatcher came cantering in and rescued everything and everyone, and blah blah. And it's just like I mean, that's the kind of thing that I was taught when I was a politics student when I was 18, and very quickly by doing actual reading on the subject, it's very clear this isn't true. But this is a global, very much a global narrative, and it's just it's one example among very many. But I do think that things are changing, and I think that we see this very specifically with the the Gaza genocide, but also the war on Iran. That I'm old enough to remember when I was in my early 20s, I was involved in pro-Palestine activism, and that we would, if we had protests of any size, we would be viciously attacked in the media as agents of a foreign power and supporting terrorists, blah 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 blah. That's not the perspective anymore. I mean, a lot of people believe this. A lot of people believe that Iran was this very 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 dangerous, kind of backward, violent country. A lot of people believe that that Hamas were attacking Israel because Israel's Jews is comprised of Jews, and Hamas are anti-Semitic, etc. When I think a large number of people realise that this is not the case anymore, I think that a large number of people are on Iran's side now who wouldn't have been 10 years ago. So I mean, I do actually have some degree of optimism again. I mean, maybe it's just it's bloody minded and foolish, but that is a one seismic change among many. And I also see outside the imperial core, I do see narratives on Russia shifting as well. I mean, or if they're not shifting, against Ukraine and its proxy sponsors in Russia's favour, that people are certainly asking. Well, we were told that Russia's so-called special military operation was this, that Ukraine was fighting this grand battle for Western values against this kind of Hitler 2.0. Then what are the Palestinians doing? What are the Israelis doing? I mean, by comparison, it's just, So, and also, if you look at polls in certain countries, so for instance, like Germany, which for many years had a sizable majority of people who supported Israel, over Palestine, and there's this whole culture of we tried to genocide the Jews, so they are welcome to defend themselves, from genocide in the future. That was like an argument that Germany made at the ICJ, I think. It's quite extraordinary. But like, if you look at polls of German citizens now, the US and Russia are trusted only slightly. Sorry, the US and Israel are trusted only slightly more than Russia, and this is after many years of rabid Russophobic propaganda being relentlessly blitzed at the population. So attitudes are certainly changing. And I think that we see in all manner of countries, which not that long ago were very dogged US allies, where their media was effectively controlled by the US and US foundations and intelligence cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy, such as Georgia, where there is a huge shift in societal and public attitudes on so many matters, because they understand that they've been lied to. They can see it in real time, and I think that we're at a stage now where the empire is all out of honey, all it can offer is vinegar, and any pushback against Western narratives is usually penalized very, very severely. But then, there in the case of Georgia, all of the fracas and the condemnations of the government for passing a fairly tame legislation, which would require foreign-funded NGOs to declare their sources of income. I think a lot of Georgians were confronted with kind of blunt force lesson in the realities of being a vassal of Western power, and they didn't like it. So I mean, again, this is encouraging, and we see countries and regions taking baby steps. Now, I think we discussed this on the last time I was on, but I think you look at what the Alliance of Sahel States is doing: Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. When these military governments took power, one of the first things they started doing was banning or trying to block transmissions of British, French, and American media, both "quote unquote" factual, but also dramas and films, etc. They see that as a key. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's wonderful. Ibrahim Traore, who is my a bit of a hero of mine now. He gave an interview where he said his greatest regret was watching French films as a teenager, and I think that like I say, there is a wider kind of propaganda infrastructure which spans social media, Western films, Western TV, which is a very, very powerful kind of narrative amplifier and enforcer. And the countries that are wise and governments that are wise are undertaking measures to limit themselves, cut themselves off from this. And I might add that in Nepal, in September 2025, there was a US-sponsored, US-financed color revolution, which toppled the government after it sought to undertake measures to implement its own kind of internet firewall to block, Western social media networks, or at least limit their influence in the country, because they understand this stuff is toxic. Sadly, the coup does demonstrate that the West is not completely powerless, but I think this is what we kind of need to be what countries need to be looking at, and an increasing number of countries are, of course.
Yeah, on a quick follow-up on that, the NED, I actually need a little clarification on this, because remember during the Doge days, we were told that NED has been shut down, and there was there's a lot of hand wringing about that on the liberal side of the political spectrum in the U.S. There was some kind of half hand wringing, half jubilation among members of the left who have learned about some of the less savory projects of the NED. But have they really been wrapped up, or have their overseas influence campaigns simply been shifted to a different department, or are they still continuing just in that area? They've just stopped all of the projects that actually help people. What's the story with NED nowadays?
Well, it wasn't actually NED that got doged. It was USAID. Although there were projects that the NED also financed, and ventures like Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia, which suffered significant funding cuts or shuttered outright. Speaking from the Serbian perspective, USAID was a huge and US-funded NGOs and media outlets and blah blah. There is quite a big employer locally, and a lot of people got put out of work as a result. People weren't actually that sad in many cases, because they were just taking a salary, and were actually often very kind of opposed to the US and US meddling in their countries, but they didn't have much in the way of choice in the particular industry that they want, or field that they wanted to work in. I think that the praising the shuttering of USAID was probably a bit premature, and I think that was kind of heavily tied up with a lot of kind of Elon Musk fandom. Which is a losing proposition. But in respect of the National Endowment for Democracy, one of the things that I thought was very interesting, and I wrote about this in the summer of 2024, that that they very quietly around this time, the NED used to have this very illuminating and comprehensive grant search where you could go on their website and look at a particular region or a particular country and see the kind of project, and in many cases the implementing organizations involved all over the world, and how much money they were getting for doing this. Now that was removed from the internet at some point over the summer in 2024. I think that speaks again to people power and shifting attitudes globally, because people like myself, if I may be pompous, but other researchers and independent journalists and researchers as well, whenever say protests kicked off in some country near or far, you could go on the grant search and find that in 99% of cases that the protesters who were at the organizations that were forefront of these protests and were in receipt of often substantial US funding were always it was like 99% of the time the groups getting traction in the media were NED funded. It was kind of a party trick you could do if you're sad like me. But I think that speaks to people power, because the whole point of the NED was it was set up to carry out overt operations and do publicly what the CIA did covertly before, and it got away with this for a very long time. And it was at the forefront of so many color revolutions, destabilization operations, particularly in the particularly in the former Soviet sphere. The whole founding purpose was to be open, and this was openness was its own protection. NED wouldn't have kind of gone underground or gone dark if it wasn't for people raising their voices about what NED does, and that is obviously seen as a threat now. So, I mean, while it is, of course, there's an argument you could make, which is that this makes NED more dangerous because we don't know precisely who and what they're funding and where. It does reflect that people are a lot more vigilant now. And if you go back to like 2005. It's quite extraordinary and quite unbelievable. And I think that actually this ties in with the degradation of media. In 2005, USAID published this very glossy magazine called Democracy Rising. It's been taken off the web now, but I published a copy of it on my website that you can find without much in the way of effort using the search bar. It was this very slick magazine which detailed how the US was behind this wave of revolutions in Yugoslavia, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Kyrgyzstan, Lebanon, elsewhere, and it had all sorts of extraordinary quotes from people who led these color revolutions, saying, "Well, we couldn't have done this without US help." So the US was actively trying to market its own democracy promotion activities overseas for a number of years, and they were this was actually heavily tied up with George Bush's war on terror, because that was all about freedom and spreading freedom and democracy allegedly. But then the US has backed off from that, because in many cases these color revolutions, in pretty much every case, these color revolutions have produced absolute chaos and misery for people. Like neoliberal quote unquote reforms, privatization, often the installation of very brutal governments, such as in Georgia, where you have Mikhail Saakashvili, who's currently in prison, but was a US darling and championed as leading this democratic revolution in Georgia, except he was having his political opponents killed and helping government ministers cover up murders they've been implicated in, and having videos of his detractors being raped played on local television and stuff, which is quite extraordinary. But now US sponsorship of this stuff is not regarded as a positive, and it automatically makes people extremely suspicious about protest groups, about the people pushing for all-out insurrection in their countries. So that is a very seismic and significant shift. Now, by contrast, there's been a significant shift in the way that the media reports on this stuff. So in 2004, you have the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Before the revolution was over, the Guardian published a very extensive expose of how the US was behind everything that was going down in Kiev, and it was being conducted according to a well-honed blueprint for winning other people's elections. I think that's basically a verbatim quote. It was very, very revealing, and while there was an element of kind of bragging that the US had done this, it was also noting that this is certainly not organic, and it is orchestrated from abroad. You fast forward to 2015, and Russia banned NED. And it made it illegal to receive NED funds in Russia, or at least you had to, if you hadn't registered as a foreign agent. Now, the Guardian reported on this, and in describing what NED did, they took a quote from its website. There was no discussion whatsoever of the fact that NED had been openly involved in regime change operations all over the world, and that the Russians might have a point in trying to curtail its operations. And we see this with the Maidan coup, which was the most blatant, kind of CIA NED putsch in history, where everyone involved, at the forefront was either a veteran of US-funded media operations in Ukraine, or had gone on trips to Washington D.C. to meet with John McCain in the years leading up to it, and many of its leaders had openly stated, working for US-funded organizations in Ukraine, had openly stated that they wanted to pull off an Orange Revolution 2.0, and get rid of Viktor Yankovic in the years and months and weeks leading up to this. So, it wasn't hidden, but the mainstream media rubbished any suggestion that this was foreign orchestrated at the time. And after the proxy war erupted, there was a quite vicious attack in the New York Times, I believe, on people pushing this conspiracy theory that it was Western orchestrated. And again, that will be because these people are getting briefings from the NED that it wasn't us, we swear, and journalists will just accept this on faith, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I like what you said just now about Ibrahim Traore. If you see interviews with him, man, it's such an amazing guy, man. So you can just know he has read a lot. He really gets it. It's a fantastic guy to listen to as well. But what he said about French films, yeah, I totally get it. I always say it in my class. I often talk about a thing like I just said, colonial mentality. And one of the most powerful ways to colonize people, you could say psychologically, is through Hollywood, Netflix, and all these kind of Western movies. And I've in one of my first year courses, I let students often pick a film that has some kind of cross-cultural dynamic, and I ask them to apply some psychological theories to that film. And what I notice, and that is really the power of Western media, man, is how often, and I mean it pretty much happens every year, students will pick a movie, and the movie will be about how the West is open-minded, liberal, and how Chinese culture is very traditional, less open-minded. And then these students will explain and that is what I try to invoke in them. I tell them, I want you to go to a meta level. I want you to question these kind of binaries, But what they often do then, especially first-year students, they will explain why China is less open-minded and more traditional, and why the West is more open-minded and more liberal. And I always tell them, and luckily they're very how can I say this, susceptible to that. So when I discuss that with them, they're very open-minded to that. I always tell them, I want you to go a step further to a meta level. Try to question that narrative that's in your mind, that the West is open-minded and liberal, and that you guys are not open-minded and traditional and narrow-minded. Question that. Where does that assumption come from? who creates that assumption? For example, the producer, the culture behind the movie, and what kind of interests are served by these kind of conceptions of different cultures. Because you will often realize, if you see it from a different angle, the West, the way it treats its minority groups, the way it treats the world outside of the West, it's black minorities in the United States, Muslims in the UK, the Netherlands, etc., etc. We are not more open-minded and liberal than any other part of the world. So what I'm trying to say is that it's just so it's these movies and these Netflix series, etc., are so good at putting a narrative in people's minds where the West somehow is very superior, is better than the rest, and it's so good at blaming the victims. Also, when it comes to imperialism, in blaming the victims for their for the disasters that are being how can you say that the disasters that are being created by the West, and really that kind of innocence of the West. I don't know. I'm rambling on a bit, but I don't know. It's just when you said Ibrahim Traore, I was like, when he said I don't want those French movies anymore, I'm like, that's just such a good point. It's such a powerful thing. It reminds me of Malema. You know Malema from South Africa. It's a guy called Malema, and he's this black South African, and he went into the shops in South Africa, and he aggressively threw out all Barbie dolls from the shelves, because he said that's just destroying the psychology of the South African children. You know, it's a bit of the same idea. But anyway, yeah, that was a bit of a comment, Kit.
Well, no, absolutely, but I think that more generally as well is that there is, as far as I can, from my own perspective, and I may be wrong, but I do think that there is a growing cognizance. I mean, it's starting from like a very small base, which is to say zero, of the fact that excuse me, the fact that US media, whether that's TV or films or otherwise, is heavily informed by the CIA and the FBI and the Pentagon. And I mean, I know there is an independent researcher called Tom Secker, who he runs a website called spyculture.com, which I would urge people to check out. And I mean, it's quite, again, in the spirit of party tricks, go on that website and type into the search bar your favorite movie or TV show, and be prepared to have your favorite TV show or movie ruined because it turns out it's CIA or Pentagon propaganda. And like there are some really quite, he's unearthed really quite extraordinary things via FOI, which show that the major US spying and military entities, they influence the overwhelming majority actually of films that get released, but also this has been ongoing for decades, and even stuff that you would never expect, like silly rom-coms like Meet the Parents, like that had involvement from the CIA, because and that involvement grants these agencies and these entities the ability to do a line-by-line edit of the script. So don't include this, don't include that, change this character from Chinese to Russian, blah blah, and it goes. I mean, a lot of the time the changes are very petty, but they all do amount to this kind of, again, full spectrum assault on your perceptions and your and on minds the world over. In fact, so I mean, this is just one example among many hundreds I could list, but. You can, again, you were encouraged to find out for yourself. There was a film called Lone Survivor, which was released a few years back. It tells it's based on the autobiography of a Navy SEAL who got trapped in Afghanistan on an assassination mission and had to basically get out, which was extremely dangerous. Now, the autobiography was actually very damning, and it admitted the author admitted to committing or admitted to committing atrocities, or referenced the fact that his peers did. That was, of course, all removed. removed, and it became this kind of heroic movie, which was watched all over the world and made many millions of dollars. The internal Pentagon review of this film said this is fantastic. People will voluntarily sit through a 2-hour infomercial for the U.S. Marine Corps. And that's how it's viewed. I remember when Top Gun Maverick, at least the second one, was released a few years back. I got talking to a friend of there was a friend of mine who brought his son and a bunch of his friends to watch Top Gun Maverick, and they all were now obsessed with becoming pilots. Top Gun Maverick was again heavily influenced by the U.S. Air Force and Navy, specifically to boost U.S. Air Force recruitment. So, I mean, this stuff does have a huge impact, including on people from a very young age. My attitude would be, just cut it out entirely. Like, it's a really, really good starting point for if you want to cleanse your society of corrupting imperial influence. You should be looking at Western news, Western entertainment and culture, if in many cases, if you can even call it that. But like I say, I think there is a growing awareness that this is true, and there is a shift against all manner of movies, genres of film, the world over, and I think that will only grow as public understanding does. I mean, again, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think if we compare where we are now in March 2026 to 10 years ago, we're living in a very different world. 5 years ago, even, and there is the empires never go out quietly, and there will be losses and victories and ebbs and flows along the way. But I do think that we're in the terminal stage of U.S. empire, and I think that the conflict with Iran or on Iran has massively accelerated this process, and I think we're seeing the weakness of the U.S. writ very large in a way that even following their 2 failed attempts to crush Ansarallah, it wasn't as clear as now. I mean, the entirety of West Asia is being lit up. Governments are no doubt reconsidering whether it's sensible to have US bases and soldiers on their territory. I think a large number of puppet governments are, kind of teetering on the brink of collapse as a result of this. Again, this is not really filtering out, into the world via the Western media or established information sources, but we're seeing the power of alternative information sources to really set the agenda or educate and inform people. I mean, again, from my own experience, a lot of stuff that I've written over the past 2 years about how the geopolitical and the balance of power in West Asia has changed in favor of Iran and the resistance, and how often using just open source data and intelligence on the woeful state of America's armed forces and Israel's. I was predicting that there would be a war with Iran and that it would be a total disaster and the Strait of Hormuz would be closed, and there would, no matter the most insane delusions of the people in Tel Aviv and London and Washington, there would be no ground invasion because there couldn't be. I feel pretty vindicated on all of these points, and stuff I wrote 2 years ago is now being shared widely, which is that's in itself encouraging.
Yeah. Well, I would also say for people who are looking for just video reporting or just videos of what's going on in the region, you can try the Chinese internet, because at least they don't have the censorship that we have in the U.S. dominated internet, which is basically the internet of the entire rest of the world. However, then you're limited to Chinese expats working in the oil sector in the Gulf states or in the whatever few projects there are in Israel itself. And so I don't think you're getting certainly all of the people who are recording things are not getting into Billy and whatnot, but you do get, I have noticed that there's been a lot more video reportage in the Chinese internet than obviously the US dominated internet has been censoring what's coming out of there. And even the satellite system, the open source intelligence thing that so many people love, that's what delayed 2-3 weeks. So
It reminds me of what Professor Morandi said. He said that there are more Western channels in Farsi than Farsi channels themselves, Iranian channels themselves. It's like it's just full with Western-dominated propaganda in Iran, and I hope they learned their lesson to be more like China. Wall it off. No more Western crap in there, because look at all these types that are and that are cheering on the bombing of their own country. I mean, that is the result of Western indoctrination for at least a huge part. What do you guys think? I know we're almost at the end here, but what do you think, Kit? All these people, these pro Shah kind of people. I think that there's a lot of Western propaganda going on there.
Well, sorry, in what context?
Well, these people, you see a lot of these people also protesting in the West, in favor of bombing of their own country. And I feel that these people are heavily propagandized as well.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I've seen a lot of people, wonder why that there aren't, more bigger anti-war protests, in the US. I do think again that if this goes on much longer, then we could very well see that, and I think they're going to be extremely angry. But a significant. I would say a significant component of the reason we're not seeing mass protests in the US is a large number of people are complaining about the lack of protests on X, rather than actually trying to do something about that. And I think what's interesting is if you think about how there was very little attempt, unlike last time. Unlike previous wars, to manufacture public consent for this, they just kind of went for it, and just kind of there was a bit of talk about how it was to prevent the Iranian government just killing their own population, a recurrent theme of past propaganda. There was a bit of talk about how this is about Iran's nuclear program, although it wasn't particularly persuasive or even effusive on the part of the people pushing this, instigating this conflict. But I mean, that is a reflection of the fact that people in power think that they can just get away with whatever, and there won't be legal or political or consequences or otherwise. I think this just makes it all the more vital and urgent that people are trying go beyond social media and really do try and hold the powerful to account, because actually they are frightened of a mass mobilization of angry people, and the circumstances right now are absolutely ripe for that to happen. So why not go and do it? But I mean, also, on the subject of people being propagandized, I think that again, propagandized into calling for their own country to be bombed. There was an amazing CNN report, I think, which was talking about how an anti-regime, quote unquote, Iranian who had welcomed US airstrikes on Iran was now less certain now that one of his friends had been killed in an airstrike. And I think that the fact that even the mainstream media is kind of acknowledging this is quite remarkable, because if we go back, and I think that that's a significant shift in the way that the media reports on this stuff. Because if you go back to the Syrian dirty war, we had like Bana al-Abed, who was this young Syrian girl who couldn't speak English with any aptitude, who was tweeting in perfect English, calling for the US and Britain to bomb her country, and this was taken like seriously, and she got given a book deal and all sorts of stuff. So I think that has rather run its course, and also. I think that the media is reporting on Iranians headed back because the fight is there, and they feel it's important to to be home and do their part, however whatever form that takes for the war effort, because they're under attack, and I think that this is influencing perceptions, and and the same lies about how they're only going back because their families are being threatened, they're only in the streets cheering Mojtaba Khomeini's ascension to supreme leader because they're under threat. This is Iran is full of anti-Semitic lunatics who want to pull off a second Holocaust. This is not being believed by a very large number of people. And I think that in the spirit of these things, the only way is up. It's just a matter of how long this takes. So I'm gonna keep calling this stuff out because I think it's important. But I do think that to a large extent that certain battles have been won, whether people know it or not.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, one more thing before.
Hold on, just to answer your last question. Having lived near Tehrangelis in the U.S., there's definitely plenty of people, not just from Iran, but from Cuba, from all sorts of parts of the world, where they go to the U.S. and they're already right wing, so they don't even need any Western propaganda. So you've got a lot of that crazy. For some reason, the right wingers from countries all over the world seem to coalesce in the U.S. and for whatever reason, a lot of left wingers go to Britain. I don't get it, but there's probably a history there.
They all
Anyway,
want to be
sorry,
white.
go ahead.
And they all want to be white. They all want to be white. They all internalize racial inferiority, these right-wing types. I mean, there is this kind of Western racialized, propagandized, internalized colonial mentality going on, in my opinion. No, I thought you were going to end it here. I just wanted to say, Kit, I think you brought me on to a good idea. I think I'm gonna email. Matt Kennard and see if we can get a panel with Kit and Matt. That would be fucking awesome, man. So I'm gonna try that. If you think that's okay, Kit.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be very much up for that.
Okay, cool. Well, we're going to end it here. You've been super generous with your time again, Kit. I wanted to ask you stuff about Noam Chomsky because Peter and me have been in a big debate about Noam Chomsky, but we'll leave that for another time. This was excellent. Thank you, Kit. And keep the good work going. We keep following you. Everybody follow Kit Klarenberg. He has his own Substack. And on to the next time.
Indeed.
God bless you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Gray Zone. All right. Until
Cheers,
next
guys.
time.
Static crackles, voices rise. Truth breaks through their velvet lies. A screen of fire, a shield of steel. BettBeat media makes you feel. No borders, no change, no silence.